My name is Joseph Bruce. My relationship with the museum goes all the way back to the Taylor Mansion, where it was, as I recall, mostly the Crest collection. When I came back to South Carolina in retirement, I sort of reconnected with the new museum because it really is completely different than it was. And sort of that connection in coming to exhibitions and getting to know people at the museum. And the next thing I know, 2.5 years ago, I ended up on the board of trustees. In addition to worrying about money all the time, since I'm the treasurer, I actually have gotten very involved. And while I'm not a docent, I sometimes play docent. I've done my own sort of spin on several exhibitions, including most recently what we're going to be talking about, the Darrel Ellis exhibition as well. I had read about the exhibition, so I was sort of familiar with Darrel Ellis by that point, and I had a sense of how incredibly personal the work is. But when I finally saw it, I was just unbelievably emotionally moved by it. The other obvious connection I suppose I feel to this exhibition and to Darrel Ellis is that we would have been in New York City at the same time. And he would have been 10 years younger than I, but we would have been there pre-AIDS and then during the bad times of AIDS both. And I think it's important to understand he was from one of the boroughs of New York, but most people in his circle, and certainly in my circle, particularly gay men, were not from New York. I mean, this is where you came to get away from the small southern town where you weren't accepted, or the small Midwestern town. It was like heaven. I mean, you had finally connected to a city, to arts, to culture, to other people. Certainly in my own case was something I could never imagine. And certainly that was true for Darrel Ellis, because his trips on the subway down to the Met and the Guggenheim had ultimately, as so many artists over the years have, led him to the Village, where he connected with other artists and photographers and could live who he really was. The reason I point out why people came to New York and what it was like heaven turned into hell when AIDS came along. And, there was just death everywhere. And this idea that, my gosh, we could all be dead and vanish, while it wasn't going to happen, there were times that it really seemed like it was going to happen. Thinking specifically about Darrel Ellis, I think it's important to remember not only was he a gay man, but he was a black gay man. That had real implications at the time. I mean, he came out to his family very early on. And as a consequence, I think if there is any kind of silver lining, and that's hard to imagine, but if there is, his experience as a gay black man who was a native of New York City was a different experience than many. I know this sort of firsthand because for about 2.5 years, I was a volunteer in there were AIDS wards. That's what they were. And this was at St. Luke's Roosevelt, which was up on the Upper West Side. And one of the things my fellow volunteers and I noticed very early on, that it was the black patients who were natives of New York who were abandoned, who no one came to see. And I think that's because they were on the down low. Their families didn't know, any friends, partners they had were equally on the down low, and they weren't going to show up. And Darrel Ellis, because he ended up spending so much time in the Village and had so many friends, I believe I recall there were 4 friends with him when he died. He was surrounded by friends till the very, very end.
Welcome to Binder. I'm Jackie Adams. Welcome, everyone, to today's Binder episode. I'm Jackie Adams, and I think if you've checked out this podcast well enough, you've heard my voice a couple of times. But there's another voice that you hear kind of on and off during the series, and that's our very own producer director of the series, Drew Barron. Before we get into the conversation with Sergio and Leslie, I just want to bring Drew's voice in a little bit to this conversation, because what most people may not know listening to the podcast is that Drew is not only a very talented podcast producer, but he's also a very talented photographer. And we talk about photography a lot at the museum, and he knows a lot, he shares a lot. But I thought today we could take a moment and let him give you some of his insights into the work of Darrel Ellis. So, Drew, I'm kind of interviewing you right now. I hope that's okay.
I guess I have to be okay with that. Hey, y'all, producer Drew here, omnipresent as always. Most people don't realize I'm always here. No matter who you're hearing on the mic, I'm still here. But right now I'm behind the mic with Jackie, and it's great to be here. So yeah, let's talk a little photography, a little Ellis.
Yeah.
So for those of you at home who are just tuning in who may not know, we have an exhibition on view right now called Darrel Ellis Regeneration, which looks at the photography of Darrel Ellis. Well, not just photography, though, right? It's,
that's right.
Paintings and drawings. But I am so fascinated by this man's process. I know later on in the episode, you're all going to really talk about it from a more philosophical level. And I respect that. Mm-hmm. But I'm a technician, and what I really, truly appreciate is what Ellis did to kind of further unique and experimental processes, not only in photography, but just mixed media art in general. Podcasting is not always the best form for the subject matter that we talk about personally on the show, because, a lot of it is studio arts. It's something that you see, and you can't see anything when you're listening to us at home. And I think that's especially true for this show, more so than even maybe some others that we've covered on this series, this ongoing series that we do here, because it is so indebted to the processes that make the work. And those are so hard to describe without seeing. I mean, the best I could do is kind of try to talk through the process here for a moment, a little bit from my perspective and what I understand. And maybe you can fill in some of the gaps. But essentially, at the heart of what he's doing is he's taking these photographs, some of which were created by his father, and he is putting them onto a slide projector and then projecting that onto a base that has cutout recesses and other shapes that then distort the image, and then he's replicating that. That's really heady and hard to understand if you're listening at home. Mm-hmm. I understand. But what it makes me think of is the old idea of camera obscura. Are you familiar with this term, Jack?
I am a little bit.
This is something I learned during my media studies degree, and camera obscura is a really old process. They've been doing it since the 1600s. You would take a room or a tent and you would completely black it out so no light was entering except for one little hole. And what that would do is it was essentially create a really primitive projector. And so it would project the light from the outside and then show an image on the wall or on the page within that room, which I know this is probably going over everybody's head, but I'm going to keep going anyway.
Well, I've done pinhole camera work before, and that's what it's reminding me of. And some people, if they've done this in elementary school, you take an oatmeal canister, you poke a hole in it, you put some film in, and you do this exposure thing. That's what it's reminding me of. But
that's
anyway,
exactly
continue.
What it is.
Yeah, okay.
The pinhole camera was invented based on the idea of cameras.
Okay, there you go.
So that's essentially how these were made. And artists for, centuries did this as a way to kind of do a photorealistic, before photos were a thing, right? A photorealistic rendition of a landscape or space. And they would draw that projection onto a piece of paper. Ellis's work kind of takes that and then flips it on its head, because instead of just doing a one-to-one recreation, he's affecting the board that it's projecting on so that he can create these sort of unique interpretations of these original photographs. It's a really fascinating process. And as I was saying a moment ago, there's no way you're going to understand it by just listening to us talk about it. You got to go see it. And you're running out of time because when this releases, this is only going to be open for a few more weeks. So please, I implore anyone listening at home to just turn this off, get in your car or take the bus or get someone to give you a ride and get down here and check this out because it is a really unique exhibition. And this is the last stop. So this is literally your last chance to see this before it closes its doors. I'm really excited about it. This has been a really cool show to have here in this space. I'm super glad, Jackie, that you've brought it here. So thank you for continually bringing like new and unique experiences to us here in Columbia. You know, we're very grateful.
Oh, thank you, Drew. And, you know, I just appreciate all your great conversations and insight and your expertise and your creativity to help sort of expand our thinking and maybe in our own mind's eye kind of visualize Darrel Ellis's work. So thank you.
Oh, you're making me feel good. Yeah, well, you know, as I often say on the show, I don't know anything. I am a novice at best at most things, including podcasting. But I know a couple people that do know a lot more about this exhibition are Sergio and Leslie themselves. So why don't we cue up that conversation with you and them and get me out of here.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Drew, and enjoy the interview. We are so thrilled today to be joined by two extra special people. These are curators who recently worked on the Darrel Ellis Regeneration exhibition that the Columbia Museum of Art is hosting through May 12th, 2024. So today we're going to have a conversation and explore this exhibition from the curator's side, hear a little bit more about how it came to be, what the show is about, and why it's really so significant. So I'd like to start off by welcoming Antonio Sergio Bessa, and for the interview, we will go with Sergio, and Leslie Cozzi. Welcome you both to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
So you both are from different museums and represent different institutions. So I thought we could start off the interview by having each of you tell us and our listeners a little bit about yourselves. And I thought, Sergio, we could maybe start with you first.
All right. So I worked for the Bronx Museum. Well, I worked until the end of 19 and I retired back then. So this project was somehow my retirement project, if you want to call it that. It's interesting how I got to museum and to curatorial. I did my graduate studies in education. I'm very interested in education issues and developmental theories and things like that. And as an educator, I began working at the Metropolitan Museum in the mid to late 90s. And then I began at the Bronx Museum in 2003 as the director of education, which was really wonderful for me. And I had an opportunity to kind of configure the whole department and so forth. And then within a few years, the then director, Holly Block, she invited me to be the chief curator because she felt that it would be interesting to begin to do projects in tandem with education programs. So in the beginning, I was not a curator. I was the chief curator, but I was working with the guest curators and so forth. But then I had this great opportunity to develop some projects for the museum that I have to say they are very in tune with the mission of the museum and also looking at the history of the community. So I think in that sense, what we have accomplished at the Bronx Museum, it's small, but I think it's a little bit unique because it's a community museum that wants to reach out to the community, that wants to tell a history of sort of the urban setting where we are and the birth of hip hop and the graffiti and all those things. And I think a lot of this came through in some of the exhibitions that we did. And also the last thing that I want to say is that I have always been very keen on collaborations. So the collaboration with the Baltimore Museum and particularly with Leslie and her team has been really great because I really like the dialogue, and I think that's how sort of the best projects kind of come to fruition.
Sergio, thank you so much. You sort of describe a really wonderful broader picture of the work that you do, not just within a role of an educator to a curator, but also community and dialogue. And I love how you center the Bronx in that in terms of American pop culture history, music history. And we're going to get into a little bit of that as we engage the conversation today. We're also joined by the co-curator of the exhibition, Leslie Cozzi. And Leslie, I thought you could introduce yourself to our listeners today.
Hi, nice to meet you all. Thanks everybody for tuning in. As Jackie said, my name is Leslie Cozzi. I've had the pleasure for the last 5.5 years to be the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Like the Bronx Museum, the Baltimore Museum is also a municipal institution, a really community-focused one, but also one that is really trying to expand the canons of art history and the stories that we tell. So it's been really lovely to work on the Ellis exhibition and really bring an artist much overdue recognition, and to work with Sergio, who is a deeply experienced curator, and really, be able to kind of think through a lot of questions about how we're making these selections and, which works are the strongest and the most representative.
Thank you, Leslie. It's really great because we have 2 museums represented, 2 institutions, 2 parts of the country, and here we are in the South in Columbia. So maybe later in the conversation, we could kind of weave these geographies together in kind of an interesting way, because I sort of have some insight and thoughts and how that all kind of looked from photographers that were practicing around the country. So I thought maybe what we could start with is grounding our listeners a little bit in the idea of what this exhibition is about. Darrel Ellis, Regeneration. I thought you both could speak a little bit to this question. What is this show really about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, this show in some ways is a traditional monographic survey of an artist who worked with photography, but really translated it into so many different media. But it's also, I think, something of a love letter. And we've been really lucky to work very closely with many people who were very close to Darrel Ellis, including his family. And so we've been thinking not just about the contributions that Ellis made as an artist and his sort of technical innovations as a photographer, and somebody who then translated that work into drawing and painting in really novel and inventive ways, but somebody who was also a kind of family historian and himself was thinking through the legacy of his father's work. And so, in a sense, this show is really a portrait not just of Darrel Ellis, but of his father, Thomas Ellis, who died before Darrel was born in very tragic circumstances, but whose work Darrel inherited and responded to in really interesting ways. I think what is so special really about Darrel's work is the way in which his point of view was so unique. Not only was he doing things that were really remarkable in terms of rephotography, but, he was also developing just a very different point of view in terms of photography and objectivity in that moment in the 80s and 90s. And unlike a lot of the contemporaries that he was working alongside, instead of presenting a picture of humanity as debased, he was sort of looking back to his father's work and predecessors like James Van Der Zee to really try to show a view of Black humanity and mobility that was kind of ennobled and had a sense of, responding to the possibility of betterment and the way in which the kind of optimistic post-war vision of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, his father's generation, Van Der Zee's generation, was radically transformed in his own time.
Yeah, I think Leslie put this so well. And I think I would just add that I think the 2 of us, throughout the process of researching his work and his life, the concept of the exhibition developed. And if you have spoken with us 2 years ago, we would have a different answer. Just to give you an idea, I was really taken with the quality of his work when I first saw. And I think I suggested to Leslie that the title should be Portrait of a Bronx Family. And then we had a discussion because Leslie said, well, but then when it comes to the Baltimore, how it's going to play out. But this idea of the portrait of a family, and also as Leslie said, this portrait that came through his father, it's quintessential to the whole project. And I hope we can discuss more of this because there's so much to unpack in that. So,
Absolutely. I'm curious for the both of you, why did you feel from the outset the exhibition was important? And maybe as you learned what you did coming along and creating the show, why was it still important to present and show?
Well, I'm going to have a very hippie kind of answer to this because I'm an old hippie in a sense, but I share with Darrel, let's say, a mystic view of life and of the universe. And that's just to say that I feel like this exhibition came to our hands for some reason and came, 30 years after his death for a reason. And that's so interesting because when you read his notebooks, some pages, he's so depressed and he's so sad because nothing goes well. But then on the other pages, he's very self-assured. And I think Leslie and I just did exactly what he wanted to do because even the title of the show was provided by him. We thought about, some maybe a smart title or something. And then a colleague of ours from Baltimore, Cecilia, she said, the show should be called Regeneration. And it's just an expression that he used in an interview. So I feel that, in a sense, this is, the old image of the message in the bottle that just kind of got to our shore and we open and, we are responding to this call. But I think, in a sense, it's very interesting how the whole process came about. And I don't want to be too hippie in this, but there is that aspect because it didn't come out of some deep research that I did 30 years ago. It just kind of came to us. And
I think it's so true. Darrel found us, not the other way around.
Darrel found us. Darrel found us.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
And there's something crazy about the work because it's so timeless, but it's also so timely. When you think about the themes he was dealing with, we were also sort of working on the show in a moment where people were talking about the twin pandemics of COVID and racism. And Darrel's life was entirely shaped by the twin pandemics of racism and AIDS. So it just seemed like, while he was looking at 19th century French painting, and so there was a deeply historical research aspect to his own work, there was also this kind of prescience in it of history repeating itself in some very sad and tragic ways, for sure.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think also the aspect of the archive, because both you and I, we are very beholden to this idea of archive. So in a lot of the exhibitions that I have developed in the past, I always started with the oral history collection as a way to create a basis for the exhibition. And for Darrel, it was his notebooks, a few of the interviews that he gave, and we really had an opportunity to get to know this person, someone that we never met, but, came alive through all these documents.
I love that notion, Sergio, because when I spoke to Darrel Ellis's brother at the opening, I remember he had such a poignant comment to me. He said, Darrel and my dad never knew each other, but they met each other through the art. And I thought that was just such a really beautiful notion to touch on. There was another avenue for them to get to know each other, thankfully. And I wonder, just kind of speaking a little bit to this response that you get when seeing his work, there is a visceral response when you see the work in person. And I wonder if you both could speak a little bit to what your initial sort of responses were when you first saw Darrel Ellis's work.
I was blown away, I would say. I mean, I think we both first saw the work at a Lower East Side gallery called Osmos that had a show of the work, I think, in 2019. And we were both, I think, recommended to go see the work by Alan Frame, who's a really brilliant photographer and curator who had basically protected the estate since Darrel's passing in 1992. But I didn't really know very much about the work other than Alan said to go see it, so I was going to go see it. And I remember walking into the gallery and sort of doing a loop and then stopping and doing several more loops and just thinking, this is unlike anything I've ever seen. And it was so complex, but also so incomparable. And yet it was deeply evocative. And I sort of immediately had this frisson of, well, this work is beautiful. I want something for Baltimore's collection. We have nothing like it. We need this. But we also, as Sergio said, I think we're both people who work really collaboratively. And so the next thing I did was bring a colleague, Cecilia Wickman, who Sergio has mentioned, who was really instrumental in the early stages of this exhibition, in sort of believing it and helping it get, on the schedule in Baltimore, and showed her the work and sort of said, "Am I crazy? This is important, right?" And she said, "Oh yes, this is definitely important. You're not just imagining this." So, having the validation of colleagues who are sort of like, no, this really is someone who was doing remarkable work. And his colleagues who were artists and photographers knew that at the time, but the sort of institutional world just wasn't there for it yet. So it's been really, really amazing to kind of see all of the things that Darrel, as Sergio said, that Darrel really hoped to happen for his work finally happen.
Yeah, for me, it was exactly the same. When I came to this gallery downtown Osmos. And when I saw the work, I immediately, I began to ask for the prices because I felt like I wanted something for myself. At the time, I didn't know that I was going to be curating the show. I was just there to see an exhibition or to have a conversation. But the first contact with Darrel's work is so strong because it's just like, where has all this been? Why didn't I see this before? And that kind of thing. It's the drawings, which are beautiful, or the paintings, which are amazingly made, and the photography very well conceived. And so everything he did was, he just didn't waste time.
We'll be right back. So now that we've sort of given the listeners a little bit of entryway into the work of Darrel Ellis, we're sort of building this really wonderful picture maybe of what they would experience when they see his work. I thought you both could maybe speak a little bit to what makes his work so unique to have those kinds of responses. And everything from style to process, what grabbed you in those responses and thought, this is what is so unique about Darrel Ellis?
I think one of the things that Sergio and I have talked about in the work is the sense of decorum, the sense of like really a belief in beauty and an interest in the canon and thinking about his place within the canon. He was really a scholar, he was incredibly well read in the history of art. And he sort of built his own syllabus. And then technically, he was also just a constant innovator. His journals are full of him sort of speculating on new ways to make art and to sort of transform sculptural objects into photographic objects and vice versa. One of the things that Makita Best, one of the other sort of brilliant contributors that helped sort of turn this project into what it is, explored the relationship between Ellis's work and the idea of photography into sculpture, which was an exhibition at MoMA. But yet Ellis was so idiosyncratic in the way that he approached it, because he wasn't just sort of taking a sculpture and pasting a photograph onto it. He was literally really trying to embody photography in a way that nobody had. And one of the really wonderful things about, for those of you that are in the Carolinas, I hope you can see the exhibition in person, because there's something really palpable about the physicality of the objects, and really enigmatic too. I mean, it was a long collaboration with our conservators, Linda Owen and Scott Homolka, who also had a major role in thinking through the sort of physicality and materiality of Darrel's process.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because he began working in the late 70s, we would say seriously. It's when he got his studio at PS1 and he's working with his friends, James Lanty, and coming up with the new processes and new strategies to photograph. But this is at the same time that the pictures generation is unfolding. And he could very well, at the time, be called into that group, but he didn't, of course. And he developed in parallel. And I think if you compare his production with some of the original artists affiliated to the picture generation, he went so much further. And because there was a lot of interest in going to photographs and generating new images based on photographs, and also there was interest in scale But when you think of his work compared with anyone from that era, his work is so much more personal. And that gives an aura of quite unique about his work. For example, I think we mentioned this when we had the panel at Columbia, that when you think of the work, for example, of Mark Tansey, who's a painter, who's very interested in scale and the canon, but his work has always an element of irony. You don't have irony in Darrel's work. Everything is from the heart. Everything is very personal. Everything is just what matters to him. It's his family, his friends, and, towards the end of his life, himself.
Yeah. The pictures generation metaphor, I think, is a really interesting and apposite one, because there is a degree to which he like the sort of canonical members of the pictures generation, he was interested in social scripts and the way that cultural messaging replicates itself and is kind of, played out in individual lives. But again, yeah, I think Sergio is right. He went farther. He wasn't simply just pointing to that mechanism. He was really thinking about how it rebounded in his own life and experience in really profound ways.
Mm-hmm. And Leslie, I think even the title, I think the more I think the title is so good. Thank you, Cecilia, for thinking about that. But this idea of regeneration, so, it goes back to his father, but also to the archive, just to quote from Edward Powell, to make it new. He was really a modernist in the sense that he made it new, in no way possible. And that's really, it's really beautiful.
When our team was working on the show beforehand, when you're just doing everything sort of digitally and absorbing the images that way, you really only have one sense of the work. And I remember when it showed up, it was really breathtaking. I mean, that's the only way I could describe it. And even though listeners are hearing our podcast and trying to kind of imagine these works and imagine everything that we're saying, there's nothing like actually coming in and getting to experience the actual work in person and that physicality, because the uniqueness of what he did really comes across. You touched a little bit also on the family through lines and some of those relationships. I thought maybe this question could delve into some of the subject matter that you see in his work. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit for our listeners in how family shows up in the show.
I have to preface by saying that it has been wonderful to work with his family. And we met many times, mostly the sisters, but all members of the family, they have been really wonderful. And I think they're very enthusiastic with the response to the exhibition. Now, in regards to his work, it's very interesting. I mentioned this several times in talking to board members of the museum on Aguirre tours, that there are the two exhibitions in life. Well, he did a few more, but two of these exhibitions, they were titled simply Images or Works Based on My Father's Photographs. Leslie, I'm kind of misquoting here, but it's something like that. Since the beginning, he had this notion that he had to bring his father's archive to a bigger audience. And when I saw that, I was so surprised that someone in the mid-'80s, when everyone is trying to be cool and, hip and this and that he would do an exhibition title like that, The Photographs of My Father. And I had a discussion with Leslie and also Alan and so forth. And we were talking about what would be the response to that. And I think probably that was something that kind of kept some galleries away from him, because I would assume that galleries would not be interested in that kind of narrative to begin with. But on the other hand, there are collectors and other artist friends who completely understood that and embraced that and gave him support to do that. So I think that's something interesting for us to think about. And then the other thing is that I feel like when you read his notebooks, his adolescence seems to have been very, very trying. I have this picture of a very depressed kid trying to finding himself in the Bronx and then coming to a high school in Chelsea and meeting different people and creating this coterie of friends that think like him. But I feel like he used his father's work as a way to build a sense of himself. So when he begins to do pictures of his grandparents or his uncle and his aunts and his sisters, he begins to have a sense of himself where he comes from, both in the sense of the woman inside him that he mentioned in the book, The Anima, as to use a Carl Jung image, but then towards the end, the image of himself as a man, and when he focuses on his self-portraits. So I think that the whole work is kind of a process of discovery based on this body of work that his father left for him.
I think that's beautifully said. I mean, I think the other thing we could add is just in terms of curatorial process. We did work really closely with the family because I think we are sort of aware that this was not our story to tell. This was Darrel's story. It was his sister's story. It was his mother's story. It was his father's story. We were very careful. We consulted with them about what details they were comfortable sharing and just wanted to make sure that we weren't doing anything without their consent, that we were, stewarding the legacy in the most respectful way we could. And it was really gratifying. As Sergio mentioned, Darrel's brother Thomas was one of the real supporters of the show, and he actually lives in Maryland. He would come in on the weekends and just give tours to whoever was in the show and wanted to know more about Darrel from his point of view. So there was a really wonderful sense of collaboration, I think, with the family in actually realizing the exhibition and getting loans that they had held on to themselves that were meaningful to them.
I love the fact that you incorporated the family as part of the process. There were times in his life that were really rough, both within his family and then externally beyond in neighborhoods, communities, society. To bring all that into the artwork and make the artwork about that and then to show it publicly is a very vulnerable space to ask anyone to be a part of. And when I spoke to Thomas Ellis, I profusely thanked him because that can be very scary to do for many families. And so when I walk and talk people through the show, what I remind them of is that not only is it a beautiful show, but it's an incredibly vulnerable show. And I think exhibitions like that call us to respect that vulnerable space because these are deeply personal realities as well. I mean, you're exploring a lot of, wonderful abstract ideas through this really wonderful work, but also there are real people, there are real stories, there are real events behind all of that. So I applaud you both for doing that and handling that so incredibly well. That is not an easy thing to do from your seats.
Thank you. Well, the family was very generous, we have to say. They were just so excited. I think that, that Darrel was finally getting some of the recognition he had always sworn to them, that he would get one day. Even with, I think, as teenagers, I don't know that, his siblings always believed him, but, they were kind of like, yeah, Darrel, whatever you say. So I think now, as Sergio said, 30 years later, to be like, oh, my kid brother, my older brother, he really was an artist. He really, really was, and to sort of have that way of remembering him, I think was really important for them.
I agree. And I think I was thinking as you were talking, Leslie, that I think through the work of Darrel that they are now seeing in these several alterations of the exhibition, they are also getting in touch with their family again through the eyes of Darrel, which I think it's really, really important.
I think you both touched on this a little bit in some earlier responses, but I'd love to delve in just a wee bit more about the time period when the work was made and why it would have been so significant to show this work, especially when the work of a gay Black man chronicling his family history, the AIDS crisis, why this would have been such a radical gesture in the 1980s and the early 90s. I'd love to just explore that a little bit more with you both.
For listeners who aren't necessarily familiar with that period, I think it's important to keep in mind that context of the culture wars, a moment when there was a kind of sort of organized persecution of gay men and women in this country, and a real kind of, institutional ability that sort of approach callousness to deal with the AIDS crisis and the numbers of people that were dying as a result of it. And I think a lot of important artists, or people who would have become important artists, were really lost in that moment because of the AIDS crisis, and their work was forgotten. I think in recent years there have been some kind of restitutions of some of those names. But I think Darrel Ellis was really a really important link in that chain to sort of bring back to public awareness.
Yeah, and in parallel to the culture wars, I think there was also a very strong market. And we cannot forget that the market has been populated by, people, artists like David Salle, who began as a conceptualist in California, and then all of a sudden he's doing this gigantic works on canvas because the museums and the collectors, they have it for that. And then you have Darrel creating very intimate, very personal, mostly black and white images. So I think that was a little bit of that, If you think like that the most successful artists in the 80s, black artists, is Jean-Michel Basquiat, you have two very different black artists kind of working in very different kind of registers. Basquiat is going for the big, sort of the Picasso archetype of the artist, right? And Darrel is going through other ways.
Again, I think it's wonderful and amazing that this exhibition exists because of the contributions that it makes to studying photography and the history of photography. And when you go in this exhibition, you see the work of Darrel Ellis and you see his father's work. But then there's an exhibition next door called Interior Lives. And if you walk through that exhibition, you see the work of Richard Samuel Roberts, who was from South Carolina. He was a Black photographer from the South, the same time that James Van Der Zeer was also a photographer. And so you see the span of about 1890 to about 1990. You see 100 years of Black photographers in America. And what Ellis represents is that 1990 era, that continuation. And if you had not done this exhibition, I mean, it's just a beautiful conversation to see the continuation of that craft. And so I illustrate that to people. That was something we never planned, but it was just a beautiful outcome of what those two exhibitions presented. So it was really special to see that. And I've seen viewers go into the shows and make those connections from the 1890 to the 1990. So it's really quite wonderful.
The Roberts photographs, I was not familiar with them until seeing your show. The photographs are beautiful, but it's also interesting to think about the kind of thematic overlaps, the images of preachers, right? This kind of inherent spirituality and the sort of way in which the work is sort of channeling religion in interesting ways, and this kind of the family portraits, the sort of wedding portraits, the sense of like life at the moment of the greatest opportunity, this moment when things are just beginning, the sort of potential.
Yeah, it was really wonderful, Leslie. And I point that out to everyone that comes in the shows, to see those connections. So we talked a little bit about the era, the 80s and the 90s and all the things that were going on. And Darrel Ellis certainly had the trials and tribulations of his life. And Sergio, you mentioned a little bit, when you delve into him, there's just maybe some darker stuff there that you could explore with his personality. But one thing that came up in our conversation for the opening reception was how you wanted to avoid making Ellis a victim. When you said that, I thought, oh, that is so interesting because so many people could go to that side of trauma and loss in the show, and you can really stay there and not pull yourself out of it. So I thought maybe you both could elaborate a little bit on this idea that came out in our conversations.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this because his narrative is very tragic. He didn't meet his father, who was killed 2 months before he was born, and eventually he died of AIDS in a very impoverished situation. But when you see the work through this narrative, it's very difficult not to be your vision to be tangible for that. So at the Bronx Museum, I wanted to start with these color photographs to just draw people to the beauty of the work itself. And then the second room is about family and so forth. And then only in the last gallery, there is a wall text that tells about his father. But then my hope was that the viewer was already caught up in the beauty of his work. And then towards the end, there is a reference to his dying of AIDS. Moving forward in his scholarship, I think scholars and curators, will have to consider that, because his work has to be seen for what it was, both intellectually and aesthetically, as very strong and unique works. And then, there is the personal, the tragic, and so forth.
Yeah, I think Sergio is absolutely right. I think we were very careful around the language that we used, and not wanting to overburden people's conclusions about the show. When we were thinking about the wall texts, we didn't describe in gory detail the how his father died, because one could make an argument that is very relevant to today's problems. His father was killed by police officers. But, again, we didn't want to turn it into a kind of spectacle of violence. We wanted it to be about the work that Ellis did, which was much more about restitution, about finding his own voice, and to acknowledge what a technician he was. I thought, one of the other people I think we should acknowledge, because we've been lucky, we've had a lot of great collaborations across the venues that this exhibition has been to. Columbia is the fourth and final stop on the tour, but prior to that, it was in Milwaukee at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And Ariel Pate, who was the photography curator there, who organized the show for Milwaukee, I thought did a really beautiful job, because she's a photo curator. So she was really able to sort of to sculpt the wall text that we had originally written and kind of adapt them to her presentation of the show, to get people to think about the specific choices that Darrel made with every image, right? That in every image, he was making a series of choices that were, as Sergio said, aesthetic and intellectual. But then, they also did programming that sort of addressed the wider cultural implications of his story. So they had, one of the programs involved an end-of-life doula, right? So thinking about the way in which his art was a kind of a response, was a form of healing and therapy and processing. So I think it was a really, really smart, respectful way of doing both, really sort of acknowledging the sort of freighted cultural implications of the work, but without making the work itself take a back seat to some kind of message about politics.
And you mentioned the word inventor, and I think it's such a great word to characterize Darrel, because I think first and foremost, he's an inventor. He came up with a very unique process, and there were so many people doing photography, but he came up with something that was really unique and his, and I think that's the angle that we should always depart, and then bring all, we've been living through very difficult decades, and there is quite a lot of this debris through everything. But I think we have always to, as curators and scholars, we have always the obligation to actually, talk about the work first, and the contribution.
Yeah, I think that is so key, because when you go into the show, you don't immediately connect it to what all is going on in the 80s and the 90s and the AIDS crisis. It's a beautiful show that really just stands on its own. It's poetic. And you don't get that sense of, how the world really was at that time. There's a joyfulness to it. And I thought we've sort of given our listeners some really wonderful insight today. And I thought what we could do is each of you, if you could speak to maybe one or two works that you gravitate to and what makes them special for you.
Well, I think for me, one of the works in the exhibition that I think is really a standout is the work that's in the BMA's collection, the self-portrait after a photograph by Peter Hujar. And it's a drawing that the artist made in the late 80s based on a photograph that the photographer Peter Hujar had taken of Darrel Ellis modeling for him in the early 80s. And it was included in the landmark Witnesses exhibition that Nan Golden organized in response, really, to the AIDS crisis and the culture wars. And so It's a really beautiful work technically. I mean, it's just lush. The sort of spectrum of white and gray and black in the work is really remarkable. It has an incredible amount of texture because it's a work that was done on paper, but then laid down on canvas, and then he continued to work on it. You can feel the brushstrokes and the sort of creasing of the paper as it sort of moved on this surface and was sort of manipulated by Darrel. But then you also get the sense of the way in which he was thinking about how he had been represented and sort of reclaiming that and turning it into something that was much more deeply psychological and really Baroque in a way in terms of thinking about light and dark, and much less kind of sexualized and objectified. So while, Hujar's photograph of him was a really beautiful photograph, there's an incredible depth to taking the way in which you are seen as a model and then turning that into an independent work of art that is, on some level the same and yet entirely different in the mechanics of it.
Yeah, I think that's outstanding work. It's one of the best work in the show. I think for me, it's very hard to just single out one example or a few examples, but work that makes me smile every time I was in the galleries is the series that he did about his sister Lori. And she's a child and she's holding a stuffed bunny. And it seemed that it was taken on Easter Day in the Bronx. So for me, as a curator in the Bronx, it means so much to me to have that image of a child in a beautiful pea coat, beautifully dressed, and she has a smile and she has a toy. Knowing the Bronx, I know that Crotona Park, where the photo was originally taken, in the 80s, it was drug infested. But to think that in the late 50s, it was a place that the families would go for picnic. So it tells a story that for me is very rich. And I think we are very proud at the Bronx Museum to have two images of that sequence. And I was trying very hard to get board members to acquire more works for the series because I wanted to have the whole series. It doesn't work like that, but I'm very proud that the museum has these two works. And then the final thing here is that for me, every time I saw that work, I was seeing Lori, but I was also seeing Darrel as a child. It's almost like he was living his childhood again through this image of his sister. And like everything else, is a work that is so rich in allusions because there is the fashion thing, there is the child thing, there is the father. Everything comes together in one. It's just beautiful. And he did maybe 7 or 8 works based on that. So it was an image that was very important for him.
Thank you both. The visitors I have seen have loved both of those works, the whole show, but in particular, the series of Lori and the Peter Hujar multimedia piece. People have really enjoyed those. Thank you both for sharing. I'd love to know your thoughts about what the relevance of Ellis's work means today, and what are some of those big takeaways around that for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I do think Ellis, in a way, is a sort of artist for the moment. I mean, I can't tell you how many studio events I go on with artists in Baltimore and elsewhere who say to me, well, I'm working with my family photographs and I'm, printing them on fabric, or I'm collaging them, or I'm doing something with them to physically interact with history. And so I think, in a really profound way, Ellis was at the beginning of what is the sort of prevailing sentiment of the contemporary art world right now.
I agree with this, with what Leslie said, and I think, again, from the Bronx perspective, it's so important to have an artist like Darrel coming to this point and having this traveling exhibition and the work recognized, because it tells a story of an individual, but also it tells a story of a community. And I think I'm very excited that there are young scholars now interested in his work, and that we'll sort of expand this narrative that Leslie and I started, and that we will take to other places. I'm very, very hopeful and curious to see what else is going to come up of this. But I think it definitely now is part of the canon. And I think his work has made a difference and will be making a difference as people will continue working with his legacy.
Sergio Bessa and Leslie Cozzi are the curators of Darrel Ellis Regeneration. If you enjoyed our conversation today and would like to hear more from Sergio, Leslie, and myself, check out the recording of our panel discussion from the exhibition opening, available for free on the museum's YouTube channel and on our website, columbiamuseum.org. Don't miss your chance to see the exhibition on view now through May 12th. I want to thank our listeners today for tuning in to the Binder podcast with Sergio, Leslie, and myself. In reflecting on our conversation today, I think a few things came through that struck me as very significant and important about this exhibition. A big part of what Darrel Ellis did was to think about identity, and I want to push that a little bit further. Darrel Ellis, because he was sort of lost to the margins of these major shifts in society during his lifetime. And I think the importance and the value of pulling an artist back out and finding them and rediscovering them again is the fact that you have given them another layer of identity. You have seen them. They are being seen. It kind of reminds me of this sort of cliche saying that you've heard philosophers say, that if a tree falls in the woods and no one was there to hear it, did it really fall? I would hope that our listeners can think about this in terms of what it meant to present Darrel Ellis's work, not only through this exhibition, but then to take it a step further and for you to see this exhibition, because when you're there, you are hearing that tree fall in the woods. You are validating that that tree existed. And I think that that is the most important thing we can do to honor who Darrel Ellis was as a person in his life, how he lived his life, and how he was as an artist. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Jackie Adams, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joelle Ryan Cook. To learn more about CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website, columbiamuseum.org.